So this was his outline for the talk, and it wasn't so much on novel therapies. It was more about clinical trials, why they're important, talking about a little bit more about the different types of clinical trials, what's gone on in the past, which it's been well covered by others, particularly Dr. Yonash, but also some of the planned and current trials that are going on that should give us some information in the next year or two, mostly with a focus on phase 2 and 3 trials. And probably the most important question of the day, not just for people in this room, but for people listening online is, why should you participate in clinical trials? What's in it for you? We've obviously talked about what's in it for the field, but what's in it for patients who might want to consider trial participation? So here's a definition of a clinical trial. It's a study conducted to look at both the safety and effectiveness of any health intervention. Could be a drug, could be a device, could be a treatment protocol. They're designed based on certain ethical guidelines, which we follow very closely, and we're monitored very closely by folks internally and externally, like the FDA and our IRB institutional review boards at all of our institutions. This is a list. I thought this was a pretty funny list that Dr. Bukowski came up with from a Persian physician on the ways to conduct clinical trials. This is from 1025 AD, so 1,000 years ago. And you can see a list of some things you want to think about before you're doing clinical trials. I don't know how many clinical trials were done 1,000 years ago. I thought the last one was the funniest, number 6. It talks about the experimentation must be done with the human body, which makes sense. For testing a drug on a lion or a horse might not prove anything about its effect on man. We talk a lot about morbidity and mortality to patients on clinical trials. I can't imagine being the investigator on any lion trial. It'd probably be higher for the investigators than for the lions, but I'm glad we've made advances in the last 1,000 years. This is one of the more famous early medical intervention clinical trials. This was by British investigator James Lind in 1747. He was the first to show and prove that citrus fruits can cure scurvy. He did what was somewhat like a randomized trial is today, comparing the effects of various acidic substances such as vinegar, citrus fruits, and cider, giving them to patients, sailors with scurvy, and essentially proving that giving oranges and lemons can cause recovery rapidly in patients with vitamin C deficiency. Sort of one of the founding fathers of our field of clinical investigation. But we've actually come a long way since then. As far as types of clinical trials, they can be classified in different ways. Some are just what are called observational, meaning we collect data that other researchers use to study patterns, study outcomes over a long period of time. For example, certain things like risks for heart disease and cancer, that sort of thing. What we focused on mostly for this meeting are interventional trials where we actually do something to patients, usually with a device or a therapy, and it's often compared to patients receiving either no treatment or commonly the standard or the old standard of care. And there can be many different purposes for clinical trials. Some of them are prevention and some of them are screening, which we haven't talked a lot about yet, and some are more active treatment trials or improving our way of diagnosing certain cancers. So there are many different types of trials. You often read a lot about different phases of clinical trials. This is sort of an important concept when you're trying to decide whether a trial is right for you. You often want to ask, what phase is this trial? The reason that's important is each phase of clinical testing has a different goal. I'll focus on the ones in the middle here. Phase 1 often focuses on drug safety. So over the years, it's been about questions like, what's the right dose of a drug? What's the right schedule for a drug? And traditionally, phase 1 trials have not really been great for patients, because the main focus was what's the safest way to give this drug, not necessarily how effective the drug is. And they were often left for patients with fewer other options. When everything had run out, you would consider a phase 1 trial. But nowadays, phase 1 trials are changing somewhat. Number one, they're not just open for anybody with any type of cancer. More often, they're open for patients with specific types of cancers, because there's already some sense of why this drug that looked interesting in the laboratory might be effective for a specific type of cancer. So we're getting a little bit more focused in that regard. We're also testing patients for example, certain tumor characteristics before they go on a clinical trial. So even getting more detailed information than just what type of cancer they have, but hey, what kind of tumor do they have? What kind of genetic changes are going on in that tumor? And most importantly, some phase 1 trials, once they get the safe dose, are then doing what are called dose expansions, where they take groups of patients with a specific tumor type and treat them all at the same dose, which is essentially doing a phase 2 trial in what's called a phase 1 trial. It's a much smaller phase 2 trial. And in many ways, there are advantages, in my admittedly biased opinion, to being on that kind of a trial, because you know you're getting the drug at that point. You know you're getting a drug that in many cases has shown some sense of safety and activity, and it's certainly something you should consider, not necessarily write off because your doctor says, I want to consider you for a phase 1 trial. Phase 2 trials are sort of the main focus there is effectiveness. How effective is a treatment? And they're usually focused on a single cancer type. And phase 3 trials, which you've heard a lot about, are more comparative trials, comparing something new to something that's old or standard. And for many years, the new was never really better than the old. But one of the things I hope we've gotten across in this day is more recently, a lot of the new stuff has been better. And we often had a sense of it that it might be better before we got to confirming it in phase 3 trials. One of the uncomfortable things about phase 3 trials from a patient's point of view is the randomization. That makes people very anxious. You lose a certain amount of control, both physician and patient, over what you're going to receive. So a lot of people will choose not to go on phase 3 trials because they're uncomfortable with that process. The way I like to look at it, and obviously not from a patient's perspective, is that even in the randomized trial, you get a 50% chance of trying a new agent earlier. And that may not be for you. It's obviously a very personal choice, but it's at least worth a discussion. It's worth a consideration as you go through your treatment. There often are trials after a drug becomes approved, like for example, expanded access trials, where they offer it to patients just to test further questions like safety, for example. So we talked a little bit about sort of clinical trials so far. I want to speak a little bit about caveats. We talked a little bit about randomized trials and how that can often throw people off, but it turns out it's the only real way of proving that a new treatment is effective. So as many flaws as a randomized trial might have from a patient's perspective, it is here to stay, at least for the time being. We're still going to be doing randomized trials. There's other concepts that are often also throw people off. One is whether a trial is blinded. That means that the researcher and the patient may not know what the patient is getting. And you might say, well, why is that? The reason that is oftentimes if you know what someone is receiving, you might make judgments that bias the outcome. And they want to try to reduce that bias, both on the patient side and the physician side. But a lot of people don't like not knowing what they're getting. And the one that throws the most wrenches into this is the whole concept of a placebo as a control arm. And that unnerves a lot of people for good reason. But you're going to be told if a placebo is involved, number one, for sure, up front. And most importantly, now that we have effective drugs, placebo controls are less likely to be acceptable options, meaning they're only acceptable if there's no standard treatment. So 5 and 6 years ago, when there was few standard treatments for kidney cancer, we relied on placebos. But for the most part now, most of these new treatments are being compared to active treatment. So you're either getting active treatment A or active treatment B, comparing it to a new treatment. Going forward in kidney cancer, there'll probably be fewer and fewer placebo-controlled trials. Here's a list, you've seen this before, of all the trials that have been done in the last 10 years. And I think the important thing about this is it's patient involvement that's made this progress possible. This is a look at 8 or 9 trials that have enrolled almost 4,000 patients. It's quite a long list of progress that can only be made by patients' willingness to participate. So it's something to encourage people that if they're interested, people you may communicate with online or through email, to consider participation, because it's only through that participation do we make this progress, and we clearly have much more progress to go. So in summarizing our recent advances, we've been able to show that we can shrink tumors in up to 10, sometimes 50% of patients with these newly targeted agents that Dr. Yonash was talking about. We can certainly slow tumor growth, which leads to lengthening of survival. So as Dr. Hudson was talking about, his patients are living longer. My patients are as well. They're living years longer than they used to in the past, but we're still not achieving enough remissions, and we need to work on agents that might give us a chance of remission or that benefit once the treatment stops. Obviously, we talked about participation. We need to do that to improve outcomes, and hopefully in the future we can see trials that, that better understand the biology of kidney cancer, as Dr. Yonash was talking about, to identify patients before they get treatment and assign them to the treatment most likely to help them. It's only through that, not just clinical research, but laboratory research that we'll be able to do that in combination. And we really need to increase the funding for those endeavors because they are rather expensive at a time when the NCI's budget is fairly tight. So you hear a lot about personalized medicine in treatment of cancer. We're not yet in the era of personalized medicine for kidney cancer. We are making certain decisions, but they're based on fairly rough guidelines. So for example, we're making decisions based on whether a patient's been treated or has had previous, or has been untreated. We're trying to assign certain risk categories for certain patients based on clinical features that suggest either a good or a poor prognosis. We're making decisions, as we talked about earlier, based on whether a patient has clear cell or non-clear cell tumors. But these are very sort of rough guidelines. We need better ones, obviously, and the hope is that we can come up with markers that are based more on the patient's own genetic profile and the genetic profile of the patient's tumor. So there's a lot of work going on in that as we speak. So recently reported trials, here's a list. You've heard some of this before. These were trials reported in the last year. Not all trials are positive. The first one was called the renal effect trial. This was randomizing patients to either the intermittent schedule of Sutent versus the continuous dosing of Sutent. The hope was that by giving it a lower dose continuously, it would either be more tolerable or more effective. It turns out there was no difference between those schedules, so they could be used interchangeably. There was another trial with sorafenib where they added on a second angiogenesis inhibitor in hopes of improving tumor control with the second drug added to the standard drug sorafenib. That's the trial in the middle there. And unfortunately, the additional drug did not improve outcomes to sorafenib. But the last trial on the bottom, which both Dr. Hudson and Dr. Yonash mentioned, was a phase 3 trial, once again a randomized trial comparing now not a placebo, but a standard of care, sorafenib, to a new therapy, axitinib, that proved clearly that axitinib was a step forward. It may be a small step forward, but it is a step forward for our patients, and now we have that clear answer. That led the FDA to approving this new, hopefully second-generation angiogenesis inhibitor for our patients earlier this year. So what's coming? Well, hopefully drugs that are more effective and less toxic. There are a series of phase 2 and 3 trials that are coming close to reporting their results, and you'll be hearing about them in the next year. They have names that I listed up here, compares, Record 3, TiVo-1, which you heard a little about, Toracel 404. We'll talk a little bit about what those are and what to expect from those trials. We also talked a little bit this morning about targeted immunotherapy and the role of vaccines and ultimately combinations that might make sense. All of these are being actively tested, and we'll know a lot more in the next year. So there are several trials trying to improve upon Sunitinib, which is the most prescribed treatment for patients with metastatic kidney cancer in 2012. The COMPARES trial is comparing Sunitinib with pazopanib, which is Votrient. The makers of Votrient hope to show that it's as effective as Sutent and maybe less toxic. We'll see that result later this year. Obviously, drugs that are less toxic are worth developing. The other trial looks at the proper sequence of this Record 3 trial. Should you start with Sutent and then switch to Afinitor, or should you start with Afinitor and then move to Sutent. So we'll get some more information about the proper sequence of using Sutent, hopefully with the record 3 result. We mentioned the AXIS trial, which compared axitinib to sorafenib and led to axitinib's approval, which was a step forward. Another step forward as far as these second-generation angiogenesis inhibitors hopefully will be this TiVo-1 trial, which Eric mentioned, which compares a new, more specifically targeted angiogenesis inhibitor, tivozanib to sorafenib, and showed that it was more effective than sorafenib. So once again, we're coming up with agents that are better than the agents that we had 5 years from now. Another important trial will compare a standard TOR inhibitor, Toracel, to sorafenib again. And to answer the question, when you failed prior treatment like Sutent, what's better, to give you another drug like Sutent or to switch you to a completely different approach, which is the Toracel drug? So we'll be learning a little bit more about the proper sequencing of these agents. And all of this information should be coming soon. The tivozanib data will be presented at ASCO, and hopefully the Toracel data will be presented later this year. So combinations, as Eric alluded to, most oncologists think if one drug is good, two's got to be better. So there have been a lot of combination trials done thus far. Most, I have to say, have been somewhat disappointing. And we'll talk about the reasons why that is. But hopefully as we get less toxic agents and we get smarter about putting these things together, we'll make some progress. You can hear these are some of the drugs that have been used in combination. Certainly laboratory trials have suggested we don't just do this willy-nilly. Certainly laboratory studies have shown that 2 drugs is often better than 1, but there are several important issues. One of them is cost. These drugs, as you all know, are not cheap. The other is toxicity, and so far many of these combinations have proven pretty toxic when given together. Here are 2 trials that are looking at combining a blood vessel strategy with TOR inhibitors. This is looking at the record 2 trial, looks at bevacizumab and everolimus together versus the standard of bevacizumab and interferon. And the INTERACT trial looks at bevacizumab and temsirolimus. These are both large trials that will give us an answer to the question of is 2 approaches to attacking the cancer better than just one at a time. We'll see that going forward. As you all know, as we've talked about multiple times today, very few of these treatments produce remissions, and we obviously need second and third line treatments. There are a couple of trials that are accruing that will give us some answers to that. There's another angiogenesis inhibitor, this agent called TKI-258, that's now in phase 3 trials. And it's once again comparing to sorafenib, so that might be a step forward as well. Looking at in the cooperative group trial, looking at combinations on top of everolimus, adding bevacizumab, and hoping that that will improve outcomes more than everolimus does. We'll see. We talked a little bit this morning about targeted immunotherapy and its potential. We talked about vaccine treatments. I alluded to one trial, one phase 3 trial, looking at combinations with a dendritic cell vaccine and Sutent. That's actually more than one trial. This Immatics trial here on the right looks at another peptide vaccine, also in combination with Sunitinib. Hopefully that will lead to more durable benefit with this drug. It's great that they're actually being compared in large phase 3 trials that will give us clear answers, but this information is probably a little bit longer away because these trials are still enrolling patients. We mentioned a PD-1 antibody earlier. This is one of the more exciting forms of targeted immunotherapy being developed. 2 points that I didn't make this morning that I'd like to make now is this drug should soon be entering phase 3 trials. It's moving pretty quickly. Hopefully the phase 3 trials will open later this year, and if positive, might lead to the drug's approval. But just as importantly, there's more than one PD-1 or PD-L1 agent in development. These are 5 separate companies, all of whom have decided this is an important pathway and are developing different ways to blocking this barbed wire that I talked about that protects cells from attack by the immune system. So you'll be hearing a lot more about these agents not just in kidney cancer, but in other tumor types as the year goes on. Chris Wood covered this very well early, so I won't beat this to death. But we're also doing clinical trials with drugs that have been shown to improve survival for stage 4 patients. We're now using them in stage 2 and 3 patients. And it'll take, as he mentioned, it'll take several years to know if they delay cancer coming back after surgery or they prevent cancer coming back from surgery. Obviously, there's a big difference between those two, but we're several years away from knowing these results. But the great news about these trials is they are accruing well. Patients have gone on them very quickly, much more quickly than we expected. So while the drugs themselves may have issues for early stage patients like side effects, and we'll have to see about effectiveness, and the patient community has been very motivated to go on trials like this. So hopefully as we get better drugs, we can then test them in the early stages of kidney cancer and prevent recurrences. I mean, that's where we can make a huge impact, preventing the need for treatment for stage 4 cancer. So in sort of closing, I think, this is obviously one fundamental question for folks who haven't considered, doing a clinical trial. Why should I do it? I mean, certainly I think, and I'm obviously incredibly biased because it's what I do, is that I think it gives you access to cutting-edge approaches. Now, obviously, the newest thing isn't always better, and sometimes it's more harmful. We've certainly seen multiple cases of that. But I do think you get access to things sooner than you might if you don't consider trials. And I do think we're doing a little bit better, as I mentioned, picking treatments than we were 10 years ago, and also picking patients for those treatments. We're a little bit smarter. We're having more positive trials. But all that being said, the participation for cancer clinical trials in the US is still less than 3% of all patients. So when you think about it, I can sit up here and talk all day about all the things I'd like to do, and Eric's got great ideas, and Tom's got great ideas, and Chris Wood's ideas are okay. But we can't do it without participation, and convincing people to come and sacrifice, because they are sacrifices to travel and take some risk with newer treatments. That takes a lot, and it really requires mobilization of the whole group of people, the whole community of kidney cancer people. So hopefully events like this will improve people's willingness to participate in trials, getting that message out about why it's important. There are a lot of reasons why you might want to consider it, but one of the questions people ask is what else is in it for me? I know what's in it for the field and for other patients, but what might be in it for me personally? One thing you could think about, and this is Dr. Bukowski's slide, but I agree with it. There's some people who think the care on clinical trials is better. You could argue that back and forth, but you're certainly followed much more closely on a clinical trial than you would be if you weren't on a trial. You're being not only watched very closely for side effects with more frequent visits, but you're being watched very carefully for, is the treatment working? And there are a lot of rules set up to protect you from not only side effects, but ineffective treatments. There are rules by which we have to remove you from a trial if it's not in your interest. And most importantly, you can always stop at any time you want once you've joined a clinical trial. The other question, which is a little bit harder to address, is do patients on clinical trials do better? And he has possibly here on his slide, and he notes this interesting data that was just presented last year. This is looking at 238 phase 3 clinical trials of all cancers done in recent years. And when you look at this slide, it's a little bit complicated. I didn't want to give too much data in this, but I think it's kind of important. For the percentage for the 158 trials that reached their goal, as far as they enrolled the amount of patients they thought, which is this sufficient accrual, that was about 2/3 of the phase 3 trials. So not all trials reached their goal for patients, which is a problem. But of those that did, most of those trials showed positive results. In fact, 143 out of 158 had positive results. There were some that had negative results or were closed early because of side effects, but it was a relatively small number, only 15 on this slide, whereas the highest reason for the trial not succeeding, which is 1/3 of trials, didn't get enough patients on them. So this makes a couple points. One, we've got to get more patients on trials so we can answer this question, but also a lot of the trials that we're doing have certainly advanced the field, but help, we think, the patients who go on them. And you can't, it's hard, that would be hard to prove, but it's certainly worth considering. There may be some advantages for you as an individual when you're considering clinical trials. So in conclusion, I think clinical trials advance our knowledge, and I think they've improved outcomes in kidney cancer, and it's been a great effort by many patients. Over 6,000 have gone on these trials that we've talked about over the day, and not only improving patient outcomes for themselves, but also the future way that we treat patients, and coming up with better treatments for people who fail is only going to happen with research. So we need to keep working on it. We need to define new approaches. We need to extend treatment earlier in disease. And we also need to focus about the patients who are unable or don't qualify for trials. What do we do with those folks? We need to do a lot more research in that area. But hopefully, in partnership, we can continue to make progress over the next decade like we've made it over this last one. Thank you very much.